Dear colleagues, before going directly to the topic and the documents, I want to use this occasion again. Annette already said it, but let me say it again, to thank the German-Ukrainian Academic Society for having this event, because you know what's special about this society is that it really kind of unites or brings together Ukrainian, or let's say Ukraine interested scholars in Germany of both humanities and sciences.
So, dear colleagues, here we are, Omeljan Pritsak and the Soviet Secret Services. I'm sure that all of you know a lot about Omeljan Josipovich Pritsak, who was undoubtedly one of the greatest, most influential, most exciting, most interesting Ukrainian scholars in the 20th century. He was not just historian, he was also a linguist, a specialist in Turkology, in Altai languages, stuff like that, also Scandinavian literature, and so on. And let me remind you how he looked like. So, and here are two books of him, right? So the one in English, which has an interesting and tragic history, if I may say so. So the origin of Rus, where Professor Pritsak tried to construct his own view on the emergence of statehood in East Central Europe, and another one in Ukrainian with a very nice and interesting title and a very nice cover, Чому кафедри українознавства в Harvard? So why do we need the Ukrainian studies chairs at Harvard? Actually, we could easily imagine comparable books, hopefully imagine, published nowadays in Germany, arguing for the necessity for Ukrainian studies chairs at some German universities. Pritsak requires, of course, a big intellectual biography. No doubt it will be written soon. I just want to show you the book, which is not published yet. It is hopefully coming. But believe me, it's not a real, like, comprehensive biography. It's just a small, if I may say so, a small attempt to analyze, as I called it here, as you see, Pritsak and the intellectual origins of the Ukrainian Harvard miracle. I'm very grateful, of course, to my friends and colleagues from the Harvard University who agreed with the idea to publish this, I would say, essay. It's a long essay. It's not a big book. And actually, in this book, which will come soon, I tried my best actually to focus on the intellectual issues. So, and that's not what I'm going to talk today. Maybe I should say it from the very beginning. So today we have a different topic, much more about, those newly declassified, newly accessible KGB archives. And maybe I should tell you from the very beginning that those archives, they could, and they already are helping us a lot to understand some aspects of Pritsak's biography. But of course, he's portrayed as a historian, as a Turkologist, as a thinker, as an essayist. That's a much broader, bigger issue. And unfortunately, today we'll have almost no time to talk about it. But you'll find something in this book. And it could be also, of course, a topic for a separate presentation or a discussion. And now, before moving, let's say, directly to the documents, let me show you this chronology, let's say chronology. Please, like, you're not supposed to remember all the dates. I'll come back to them in my talk. But I think it's important if you look at it like quickly and read it on your screens, you'll see that even from this list, which is not complete, it's just until 68. So we are not taking like the events afterwards. Like we'll see the complexity and the amount of issues here. To mention just one very important thing, that Pritsak started his university studies in Lviv, when it was a Polish university, Jan Kazimierz University in Lviv, and he graduated from it when it was Soviet Ukrainian Lviv University. So it's still a big difference. Like imagine, like you start and you end your education in a completely different political context. And then here, of course, you'll see the date when he became the doctoral student of Agatan Krimsky, a prominent Ukrainian Orientalist, right, in Kiev. And then October 29th, 1940 is a very important date, is the date when Jan Pritsak, so young PhD student, was mobilized to the Soviet army. Please keep this date in mind. It's important for the KGB story we'll be talking about later on. And then already in June 41, so right after the start of the German-Soviet war, he became a Soviet prisoner of war, and pretty quickly, pretty soon, resumed his academic activity in Lviv and Kyiv, and then later on in Berlin. So like imagine like the Second World War, in case of Pritsak, first it's Lviv, then it's Kyiv, then Bashkortostan, so in Ufa, where this regiment was located of Soviet army, and then again Lviv, Kyiv, and Berlin. And then you have the dates of his post-war academic, incredibly quick and impressive career in West Germany, right? So graduation in Göttingen, PhD in Göttingen again, 1948. Then in just 3 years, habilitation, so the second dissertation. And then the next year starts teaching at the University of Hamburg, where in 57 he became a professor of anti-philology, Turkology, and Central Asian history. And here, dear colleagues, we have the second very important date, May 59, his visit to Soviet Ukraine. Maybe I should tell you immediately that actually those two dates, so October 40 and May 59, they are like key dates for our today's topic. So for Pritsak's adventures with the Soviet secret services. And what actually documents are we talking about? We're talking about this stuff. So there are three, maybe I shouldn't say huge, but pretty big volumes, pretty big, impressive volumes. You see the number of the case, it's 839. So 3 volumes, and that's from the collection of, now listen carefully, some of you already know it, some maybe not, is from the collection of the State Archive of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. So Архів Служби зовнішньої розвідки України. Recently, this archive declassified a number of very interesting documents, not just Pritsak's. But today we'll focus on him because it's really enough for one lecture. And as you see immediately from the covers of the documents, so 2 volumes are called Linguist. So Linguist, so that's the operative name for Pritsak given by the Soviet authorities. Pretty obvious, so Linguist, because he knew a lot of languages, and that's actually openly said, that like the guy who could freely use more than 10 languages. And the last volume has a different name, it's Lukyanovich, and that's like change of name. I'll explain it later on. Some of you maybe immediately could guess why this name. If not, I'll tell you later. Let's keep it as a small, so to say, secret for the rest of the story. Now, dear colleagues, let me show you. That's just like, again, to give you like this, like, let's say, archival documental feeling. Those are 2 student documents, one issued in Lviv by the Polish government already, right, in 39, and the next one by the Soviet government. So it's how history changed in this part of the world, so in West Ukraine, right, this phenomenon of double occupation, as we all know, change of power, and he graduated already in Soviet Lviv. Okay, dear colleagues, let's move kind of chronologically back to the year of 1940, 1941. So end of September 1940, it's already 1 year of the Soviet occupation of West Ukraine, right? So former Eastern Poland. Pritsak graduated from the university and he was enrolled in the doctoral program, as I said, at the Institute of Linguistics of the Academy of Sciences in Kyiv in a specialization Islamic philology. So he met Professor Krymsky in Lviv. Krymsky was impressed by Pritsak's knowledge of Eastern languages and invited him to join the academy in Kyiv. And actually, it's interesting. So it happened in September. The next month, so October 1940, the name, Pritsak's name, appeared in a secret memo, actually known already for years. It's not a new archival, let's say, sensation. It was known, so a secret memo of the Soviet Special Services, in which Pritsak, along with his colleague, the literary scholar Yuri Stefanek, who actually also lived a long life in diaspora and immigration later on, so was mentioned as so-called Kyiv participant of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So someone who was kind of sent from Lviv to Kyiv in order to write anti-Soviet stuff and to communicate for the OUN. As we all know, of course, OUN, this right-wing underground Ukrainian nationalistic organization, first created in 1929 in Vienna, very active in interwar Poland, and then in the Nazi-occupied Europe. What is interesting here, like how it happened? There are interrogations of several OUN members who said during their interrogations that actually what I just told you, that Pritsak was the member of the organization sent from Lviv to Kyiv. As you could imagine, Soviet services immediately were interested in this story, and they decided to prepare a meeting, interrogation of him himself. But at first something else happened. So Pritsak was drafted to the army. Here you see, again, original document, the date that from the October 29th, Pritsak is a рядовой боец, so an ordinary soldier, a common soldier in the Red Army, far away from Ukraine, as I said, sent to Ufa, Bashkortostan. Actually, accidentally or not, Ufa is exactly the place where later on the entire Academy of Sciences from Kyiv was evacuated. And institutes of Academy of Sciences, they actually spent years of war in Ufa when the German troops approached Kyiv. Now, dear colleagues, what's very interesting here? So pretty soon, Pritsak and his regiment, they were transferred from Ufa to Bila Tserkva, so a location not far from Kyiv. And then immediately, so to say, the idea of his direct interrogation came. I could quote you, it's not here, but I could quote you that in April 1941, officers of the Lviv branch of the NKVD reported to Moscow that Pritsak, who spoke 12 languages and who was allegedly associated with the OUN, should be considered for recruitment and further infiltration into the OUN leadership. So on the 5th of June 1941, and of course you immediately have another date in your head, so 22nd of June, the invasion of the Third Reich started, right? So a couple of days before, on the 5th of June 41, Pritsak was summoned to Kyiv for interrogation. So he's still a soldier, but he's interrogated by the NKVD. And during this interrogation, he wrote a very interesting document in Ukrainian, which is called «Мої політичні переконання», so my political convictions. It's a couple of pages, incredibly interesting and very sincere, if I may say so, also based on, let's say, Pritsak's later memoirs and notes. So he admitted his support for the idea of political independence of Ukraine. At the same time, he said that he was not involved with the OUN, and he emphasized his opposition to the organization's terrorist methods. He also said that he would rather define his beliefs as monarchist, which means, of course, in this case, admiration for Vyacheslav Lipinski in political philosophy, and also direct contacts to Pavlo Skoropadsky and his circle in interwar Europe. For instance, Pritsak wrote, it's still very relevant work, a genealogical study of Skoropadsky family, stuff like that. And he also confessed in this text that he could not define himself as a truly Soviet-minded person. So, what was the result of the story? The result of the story was that, you could have a look here, that on the 5th of June 1941, Pritsak signed an agreement, so the Russian name Podpiska, it's official terminology of Secret Service, an agreement to cooperate with the Soviet officials, voluntarily of course, and claimed that he voluntarily undertook to render full assistance to Soviet intelligence in exposing enemies of Soviet power. Handwritten. When this document was produced, he also agreed on a surname or like special name used in the NKVD documentation, and that name was Halichanin. So someone from Galicia, from East Galicia, as he was. Later, KGB documents clearly state that Pritsak did not perform any agent work, and immediately after the German attack on the Soviet Union, he disappeared from the Secret Services site. So again, look at the dates. So he is 5th of June, 22nd of June, a big war started. And actually, when it came to an end, it's also part of the documentation in those files in 46, 47, Soviet authorities tried to check whether Pritsak still lives in Lviv or Ternopil. And of course, as you could imagine, they found out that he was not there. Okay, we know more or less the continuation of the story. German captivity, pretty quickly release. He continued his academic work, first in Lviv, then in Kiev, and then finally in Berlin. So he came to Berlin in summer 1943, and he registered himself as a student for the Friedrich Wilhelm University. There is actually a note in a book of students that one colleague helped me to find. And he himself, I mean Pritsak himself, in his memoirs later on, he claimed that he was released from forced labor in Germany at the request of Professor Richard Hartmann, whose seminar he attended in Berlin. It could be speculated that maybe Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was in Berlin at the moment, actually helped Pritsak to get this much better student status. The fact is that he was pretty active during the war. He was the head of the Ukrainian student community called Mazepist, and actually before the war, Pritsak published several very important source-based research papers about Hetman Mazepa. And he was on research trip to Vienna when the Second World War stopped. So he was in May 45 in Vienna. The war came to an end, and then in spring 46 he resumed his studies, but now of course not in East Germany, but in the West, in Göttingen. And actually in Göttingen, why Göttingen? Why not something else? Because one of his Berlin professors, a prominent Iranianist, Hans Heinrich Schäder, also moved from Berlin to Göttingen. Now, dear colleagues, as I already mentioned briefly in the chronology, in post-war years, Pritsak made an impressive career in West Germany. So 48 PhD, 51 habilitation, 52 teaching in Hamburg. The same, actually, that's probably also important to show you. The same year, 52, he married a lady you could see on the picture, Nina Moldenhauer. Next year, their daughter Irena was born. And the same year, so it's the year 53, Pritsak received the German citizenship. So he's fully integrated, and as the fulfillment of this full integration, 1957, he became the full professor of anti-philology, Turkology, and Central Asian history at the University of Hamburg. Incredible career. Pritsak himself explained this career by the fact that, of course, he did it not in Ukrainian studies, but in anti-philology, Turkology, and Central Asian history. So topics which required, of course, special knowledge and special competence. What is interesting here, dear colleagues, and that's very relevant to our next story. While teaching in Hamburg, Pritsak became one of the founders of the so-called Ural Altaic Society, which he chaired from 1958. And he also edited, during his life, he edited different journals, initiated many academic institutions, networks. So one of them was this academic journal published in German language, of course, Ural Altaiische Jahrbücher, whose mission he saw as the internationalization of German Altai and Turkic studies. And one of the, let's say, elements of this internationalization for Pritsak himself was an involvement of scholars from the socialist bloc, including the Soviet Union. It's really interesting. I've forgotten to take one of those examples to show you, but believe me that one of the members of the editorial board of this Ural Altaic Jahrbücher was a Moscow-based Russian-Soviet Turkologist called Boris Serebrennikov. The very fact that someone like him was allowed to become a member of the editorial board of West German journal, of course, meant a lot. And in this context, so it's late 50s, Pritsak started planning research trips to Poland. On the one hand, it's like moving back to a country where he was raised, right? Even though, of course, not to the eastern parts of pre-war Poland, but now to Warsaw and Kraków. But he still have a lot of friends and colleagues there. And it was possible to realize already in 1959. And then in this year, 1959, spring 1959, something very interesting happened. And this story is known. So for people who knew Pritsak, knew his biography, there's absolutely no secret about it, that in the year of 1959, he traveled from Warsaw to Soviet Ukraine. He visited Lviv and Ternopil. And I remember also myself writing some articles about him and asking myself, how could that be possible? Because again, let us not forget, dear colleagues, that in principle, the Soviet authorities had every reason to detain Pritsak as a former Soviet citizen, as a Red Army soldier, and a prisoner of war who stayed abroad. But that's not what happened. So what actually happened? The main reason for Pritsak to go to Soviet Ukraine was to meet his mother, Emilia, who stayed in Ternopil. And actually, when he went to this research trip to the socialist Poland, the first plan was to invite or to get a permission, so to say, to get a permission for his mother to go from Soviet Ukraine to Poland to meet with her son. And then apparently one could speculate maybe to stay abroad, even though let's not forget Poland was a socialist country, of course, not a part of the Western Bloc. The documents I've talked about, so the documents from the KGB archives, they help us to explain what actually happened. So the case of Linguist, as I showed to you, so that's the pseudonym chosen by the KGB for Pritsak, was actually opened in March 1959. And its justification, dear colleagues, stated that Pritsak, as a professor at the University of Hamburg, speaks 18 languages. Now we have 18, so there were 12, now 18. Has great connections among the Ukrainian immigration in the West, and could be of real interest for the Soviet Secret Service. So they started reading his letters to his mother, and of course they decided not to permit her to leave the Soviet Union, but instead to convince Pritsak to go to the Soviet Union, and then like to start some, let's say, operational game with him. But again, how to do it in a convincing and reliable way? So there was a decision, the decision was taken to give this as a task for the KGB major named Kyrychuk, who was sent also to Poland, to Krakow, and his task was to establish personal contact with Pritsak and to convince him to come to the USSR for additional observation and possible recruitment. So Major Kyrychuk traveled to Krakow. As you could imagine, he reported on every step undertaken, so you could read all those long reports in the case. And in his report, he characterized Pritsak as a man absorbed in science, not at all interested in politics, and not connected with Ukrainian emigration. Based on his mostly good impressions from personal contact, Kyrychuk suggested organizing a trip to Soviet Union to try to change Pritsak's somewhat skeptical attitude towards Soviet reality. One of the arguments, so one argument was of course to visit his mother, who lived in the outskirts of Ternopil. Another argument was a letter written under KGB pressure by Ivan Kripakevich, a prominent, Aneta mentioned him, so as a person who had the name of institute where I wrote my PhD. So this guy, Ivan Kripakevich, and he was forced to write a letter of invitation for Pritsak in order to convince him that the old professor and old colleague invites him to go to the Soviet Union and guarantees that there is no danger for his life or security. Okay, what happened? On the one hand, Pritsak warned his wife and some colleagues about his plans to go to the Soviet Union. On the other hand, he applied for the Soviet visa in a consulate in Warsaw. By that time, his mother's apartment in Ternopil was equipped with full civilian staff. All Pritsak movements, of course, were monitored, telephone conversations tapped, photos taken, and the idea behind this trip, and it is openly said in the document, was to, now I'm quoting, to re-recruit, перевербовать, so to recruit Pritsak again as a as someone who could work for the KGB. Pritsak arrived to Soviet Ukraine. He even gave a talk at the institute, which now holds the name of Kripakevich. He also visited his mother. And then on May 5th, 1959, Major Kyrychuk, together with two high-ranking officers of the Lviv branch of KGB, had a conversation with Pritsak, I'm quoting again, as our former employee. So they reminded him about the подписка from the year 1941 and asked for like a new stage of cooperation, if you wish, even though no cooperation happened. Pritsak, according to their reports, stated that he had no opportunities for intelligence work and would not be able to combine academic work with the fulfillment of their assignments. Nevertheless, next day, so their first meeting was May 5th, and on the next day, May 6, a new agreement on cooperation was signed. You have it here on your screen. Actually, it's interesting, dear colleagues, let me stress it that this one is written in Ukrainian. Only the confirmation from the KGB officials is in Russian. So the text is in Ukrainian. And in this text also said that they agree on a new surname, and now it's Lukyanovich. Lukyanovich, as for me, it's pretty obvious. Pritsak was born in a town of Luka in East Galicia, so they just took the name of a place where he was born. As you could imagine, this document I'm showing to you now was probably the only way we could speculate about it, for Pritsak to get permission to go back, so to leave the Soviet Union. So he was allowed to freely leave the USSR. It happened on May 8th, 1959. And the plan was that he will come again to the big conference of Oriental scholars in Moscow next year. And since that, his mother, of course, stayed in Ternopil, but somehow there were talks that maybe they will allow her to leave the country as well and to live with him in West Germany. Now, what is very interesting, dear colleagues, so this situation happened. So the document is received, the visit took place, but pretty soon, already in summer, so in the August of 1959, the first main directorate of the KGB in Moscow concluded, I'm quoting here, that the arrangements for Pritsak's re-recruitment were not prepared thoroughly enough, because his arrival in Ukraine had become known to a wide range of persons in Poland and the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviet secret services assumed that Pritsak would be checked by German counterintelligence after his return to Hamburg, and therefore abandoned the idea of contacting him. So it's almost like the same story as in 41, like no further contacts happened, but they waited for him to come next year, 1960, to this Congress of Orientalists in Moscow. And in this respect, they prepared this document, a very interesting one. So it's a plan how to work with our foreign agent, Lukyanovich. And that's an amazing document, because it has psychological characteristics of Pritsak, which could be, of course, debated. It has some observations about how this own story happened, but it also included a list of topics to be discussed with him in Moscow. And in this list, you have the question starting from the organization and structure of the seaport of Hamburg to the specifics of the work of the local university. So the KGB planned to offer Pritsak funding for a journal with our agenda and to task him with rallying patriotic Ukrainians in West Germany around him. That's actually a very typical idea. I mean, establishing and financing a journal that could gather people with kind of, as I said, with our agenda. We know such stories from the cases of another people, also like declassified now. The Moscow Congress opened on August 2nd, 1960. Pritsak, who had been announced as a participant in the program, did not attend. So he never showed up. So he managed for the second time to avoid further contacts and assignments from the Soviet secret services. In December 1963, his file was turned over to the archives because Pritsak, I'm quoting here, has been evading meetings with the operative for a long time, and there are no possibilities of re-establishing contact with him. By the time this decision was made, Pritsak, as we know now, was already in the United States. So he was invited there in the year of 1960. He never saw his mother again, who died in Soviet Ukraine in Ternopil in 1961. But pretty soon he became a professor, at first professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard, and then the founding director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Skipping a lot of stuff because we have almost no time left, let me briefly give you some conclusions, dear colleagues. First, recently declassified KGB archive documents provide insight into the methods used by the Soviet special services and add important details to our understanding of the biographies of scholars who came under the scrutiny of the security services. However, like any other source, they require contextualization and comparison with other surviving archive files. Second, an analysis of various internal KGB documents leads to the conclusion that the Ukrainian diaspora situation was generally very poorly understood by the Soviet authorities. The special services tried to orient themselves, needed guides, relied on superficial, fragmentary evidence, and had a very vague idea of their own interests, all of which is well reflected in the so-called 1960 plan for working with Pritsak. Again, their questions about the infrastructure of the Hamburg seaport coexist with assumptions about the possibility of financing a periodical. And all this gives the impression of a just-in-case approach, rather than well-thought-out, systematic intellectual work. Because, we are often used to believe that KGB knew everything and, played any game they wanted. It's not the impression I got from all those documents. Third, the story of Pritsak's visit to the Soviet Union in 1959 is also interesting for studying the cooperation between the Soviet and Polish secret services. We have some evidence on Pritsak also in the IPN archives in Poland, and we know from the Soviet operative documents that, for instance, Polish colleagues proposed that if needed, they could stop Pritsak on the border. I mean, Polish-German border. But the Soviets said, no, please don't. So don't give him an impression like that. Next point, Pritsak twice signed a cooperation agreement with the Soviet special services, but did not carry out a single task or submit a single report. Not at all. However, the KGB itself recognized the procedure for obtaining the second signature as unsatisfactory and recommended refraining from attempts to establish contact in Hamburg. At the same time, dear colleagues, despite the fact that the KGB had powerful, compromising material on the Harvard professor, the authorities never even seriously considered using it, unlike, for example, in case of Yuri Shevelyov. And the last, interest in Pritsak and his activities intensified in the KGB in the late 70s and early 80s, in the context of the unfolding activities of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And that time, there were again serious discussions about inviting Pritsak to the USSR, but two things ultimately prevented this. Harvard's support for research of the Holodomor, 32-33, and Pritsak's highly critical article about the so-called 1500th anniversary of Kyiv, published in 1981. So his travel was banned. Pritsak arrived in the Soviet Union in 1990 and spoke in the plenary session of the First Congress of the International Association of Ukrainian Studies. Later on, he became the founding director of the Institute of Oriental Studies in Kyiv. And nowadays we could add those very tragic, very sad, but still important aspects to his biography. I am very grateful for your attention. Thank you very much.